Have you submitted your proposal yet for the 2024 International DIR Floortime Conference this October live online? A unique 10-day experience, a must for all floor-timers. You can find out more details at icdl.com/conferences. You're listening to Affect Autism, where affect is the #1 tool we use in supporting child development through playful interactions.
Welcome back, listeners. You have it on the We Chose Play podcast from Affect Autism. I'm Daria Brown, and this week I have Andrew Klein, who is a pediatric occupational therapist and DIR expert and training leader at Emerge Pediatric Therapy in Durham, North Carolina, where he has a specialized role in facilitating reflective supervision with his colleagues. He is also a certified trauma professional through PESI. He started his career at the Rebecca School in Manhattan, where his floor-time journey began, and he is the father of 2 very active young girls. Welcome, Andrew.
It's so good to be here. I love your podcast so much. You have so many wonderful, beautiful minds on this podcast, so I'm really happy to be here with you and enter the fold of your wonderful guests.
Well, thanks. Today's topic is reflective practice in DIR. And before we get into definitions, I just want to mention I will refer people in the blog post to the podcast I did with Dr. Jerry Costa on formation, and he talked about how we train professionals in this field, and reflective practice was part of it. And we're going to take a little bit of a different slant on that today. But before we get into definitions, tell us how you came into this work and being interested specifically in reflective practice as a focus as part of your career now.
Yes, I'd love to start with that. I feel like painting a picture of this journey is a really helpful part for our audience, and we'll talk about how painting pictures itself is like a really big piece of the reflective practice. But I also want to say that I think it's really helpful to elucidate the journey, because I know your podcast is both for professionals and for parents, because we're going to talk a lot about how the reflective practice framework was originally created for professionals, but how it's really become so broad in its application and is so helpful for families and parents and all kinds of fields and areas of work. So yeah, I know you mentioned I started at the Rebecca School. And so coming right out of the gate as an early professional, was fortunate enough to start my career at a floor-time school, right? And the Rebecca School, I'm sure your listeners know about, because you've had many guests that work at the Rebecca School or have had relations with the Rebecca School. It's an incredible place. And one thing that I want to talk about, and I don't know if you've had guests talk about this before, but in the culture of the Rebecca School, there is such an amazing culture of recording and watching video together. And this was such a frequent occurrence. All the families were consented on board with taking session video for the use of like bettering the professional practice that was going on there. So people would record, we'd sit in meetings and watch video, and we'd think about, oh, hey, what's going on in this session, right? Let's just watch, let's just sit and watch and like absorb what's happening and think about what's happening. And at the time, I probably took it for granted. Being my only professional setting, it just seemed very normal to me. I really enjoyed those times. We'd sit together with our teams, with Dr. Gil Tippy, and really just sit around and watch video together. And I loved that. And then when I left the Rebecca School, I practiced a couple of years on my own and moved down here to Durham, North Carolina, where I currently work at Emerge Pediatric Therapy. And Emerge is a wonderful clinic. It was at the time owned by Bonnie Hacker, now owned by Brittany Winslow. But there's always been a wonderful culture of supporting, the floor-time model and strengths-based approach. So it's a really strengths-based place. But what I noticed is, that whole idea of sitting and watching video, or really being able to just absorb what's going on in the session, wasn't there. And I imagine it's not there at very many places out there in the world. And so we talk about like cases, but it would be more of a traditional, like, let's analyze this from a sensory processing lens. Let's analyze this from one of our frameworks and think about what's going on there. And I realized something was missing without that video piece. Something to me was really valuable about that idea of just sitting and watching what's going on in this session. And of course, we do this in our floor time courses, but to actually have it in the culture of what you're doing day to day is pretty special. So I got to a point with Emerge where we talked about sort of furthering this role of mine as a specialist on the team, um, in actually sitting down and doing reflective supervision with my colleagues. And at the time the decision to call it reflective supervision felt almost semantic. Like I was like, I could call this floor time coaching, but I like the idea of calling it reflective supervision because to me, what we're doing is sitting together and reflecting on video. And from there, what I really wanted to do next was gather more information on what this means to professionals. So a few years back, a colleague of mine, Dr. Kavitha Krishnan, and I were talking, and we're like, there's no research on this role you're doing. Like, there's nothing out there that's talking about like what it actually means to do like reflective supervision and how that impacts therapy practice. And that seems like a shame because it's to us really valuable, right? And so our next step was to actually create a research study on the reflective supervision work we're doing. So the design of the study was single subject, 6 weeks of reflective supervision, treatment phase, and then 6 weeks of a non-treatment phase. And we have recently gotten data back on this. We found that 50% of the participating therapists showed improvements in reflective measures. We use something called the Reflective Practice Questionnaire, which is just sort of a general reflective practice piece. And then there are two metrics in the OT world or actually there's a bunch of them, but we use two um, from this thing from the University of Chicago. And they basically have created all these amazing metrics for what we call therapeutic use of self. Um, it's a pretty cool recent addition to the OT world of data gathering. And I think it's great because that's what we want to look at in terms of the personal connection piece, right? How we are using ourselves in treatment. So we were like, this is great. This is a great metric to use. And so we integrated that as well. The two measures are called the PCAM and the CASI-P. But anyway, they're just ways of looking at the way we're using ourselves in practice. And what we found was 50% of those therapists participating did show improvements during the treatment phase and afterwards, which I thought was amazing. And then the reflective practice questionnaire, again, looks at the things we traditionally think about in reflective practice, and we'll talk more about that later, but it's things like reflection in action, reflection on action, and other things correlated with reflective practice, such as, confidence in the work we're doing and feeling comfortable in our work and all those things.
All of this will be linked to in the blog post with this podcast.
Yes, that's excellent, because I think they are really interesting metrics for people to be looking at, and hopefully other people can find ways to integrate them into your practice, because gathering data is a valuable part of what we do. So I realize, though, the next step is really helping to have other practitioners also integrate this work into their practice, because during creating this research study, the first step is always the literature review, right? So in creating this, I actually really deepened my own understanding of what reflective practice and reflective supervision is. And I realized that to support other professionals in this, it goes even beyond the idea of that watching video, reflecting on video, and just asking reflective questions. There's a whole depth in the world of reflective practice and reflective supervision itself. Some of it has been really beautifully developed by our colleagues in the world of infant mental health. Reflective supervision, interestingly, is also really robustly developed and looked at in the field of nursing. But again, there's relatively little for OTs, SLPs, and PTs. There's plenty of like articles. People will publish stuff every once in a while talking about how meaningful reflective practice is and how it's valued in our literature, but it never goes past that. It kind of circles back to like, we're looking at how this is meaningful to therapists. And then it's not something people are either finding easy to study or diving into studying. And I will say that gathering getting an IRB for recording video and like looking at videos and getting metrics of the video was a lot of hoops to jump through. We had to blur over, I think, hundreds of hours of video to make it IRB compliant, because we want to really work hard to protect the information and protect the kids that are involved in this study, which is valid, but it's a lot of work.
So I'm going to pause you for a minute because we're throwing out a lot of acronyms, and just in case
Oh,
parents or who
sorry.
people are listening. So OT's occupational therapists, which Andrew is, SLP's speech language pathologists, and PT's physical therapists. I think those are pretty easy, but IRB. What's IRB?
Ah, it's an institutional review board. So when you submit to have research done, you have to submit it through an IRB. So that's the organizational body that really controls research and is the gateway to doing research that can eventually lead to publication and furthering the world of science. So it's a huge piece of getting research done. Our next steps, again, were to try to broaden this for others. So we have recently created what I think is a really nice class that I was able to share with you on reflective practice to kind of broaden, I'm hoping, interest in reflective practice on its own. Because reflective practice is a beautiful subcurrent in the Floortime model, but it has a whole world of literature that lives on its own. And I think helping people focus on that specifically has its own merit. And our hope is that if people are interested in this, we can continue to further our research into reflective supervision and create a follow-up course on reflective supervision and gather data on that on its own, which again would be really valuable because I love the research we've done on floor time. There's so much beautiful works on the value of floor time to families. I want to look at the value of reflective practice to practitioners and how it helps us in our work settings.
Now, that's a really good point because I just retook DIR 203, which is the advanced certificate course from the International Council on Development and Learning. I had, I had my advanced certificate from a number of years ago, but just to review and refresh my knowledge. And so that really is about reflective practice, and it's putting it in action. And we talked about all those things that you mentioned in action, on action, that you're going to, define for us soon. But the thing that I took away from going through it the second time around was the value to parents as well, because, my primary role is parent. I'm not a clinician. And so I hope that parents listening understand that this is part of that whole self-reflection piece in floor time. It's the the ninth functional emotional developmental capacity self-reflection. And, I had a number of podcasts on that with Dr. Andrea Davis on reflecting on videos of me playing with my son. And it's the first step, Andrew, that I tell parents to do, and it's the one that is the most avoided.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the reason I bring that up is to say that I can imagine that as a professional, it's also a little bit avoided because I mean, luckily in DIR 203, when they're getting their advanced certificate, you have to show videos, and in 201 and 202 as well, when you're getting your basic and proficiency certificates, you have to show videos and reflect on them. But are people really making that part of their everyday practice is the question, and the value of doing that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And um, I think the beauty of reflective practice is that it really comes back to that empowerment piece, the autonomy piece, but on the caregiver and therapist level, right? Like we're all about empowerment and we're all about autonomy and we talk about so much with our kids, but the reflective realm is one of the most powerful places for us to find that. And but it's hard, right? And always the paradox, the catch 22 with our beautiful floor time work is that this is really the most powerful path to like empowerment, but it goes against so many of the things that are in play in the world that kind of are obstacles to this, right? The whole culture and dynamic of the world around us plays against this being something that we can kind of sit into. And I think you were part of my presentation at the last conference where we talked about obstacles in metaphors because there's so many of them, but a lot of them are obstacles to reflection, I think. Um, yeah. I think another challenge with reflection is that it also can mean a few different things in our floor time world. So capacity 9, right? That's our self-reflection and internal standard. And that is an important starting place because it also reminds us how much we have to have in place to be in our reflective space, right? This is way up our in our capacities, right? We have to be well regulated. We have to have a lot of things going on in place to really be in a reflective mode. So it's not something that comes easily, and I feel like is also elusive and abstract. So one of the things I've been trying to do is also just maybe bring some vibrancy and joy around reflection too. I think that it has a lot of merit to kind of really focus on this and bring enthusiasm to this. I was speaking to my colleagues recently, and I said that if you were on The Bachelor or Bachelorette, and your suitors were floor time, SI, maybe other specializations like feeding or reflective practice, you'd probably kick reflective practice out week 1 without even getting to know them because they just don't have that natural appeal to you. That
And I wanna again say you mentioned SI, sensory integration.
Sensor integration, thank you. Yes. But I think that bringing a warmth and attention to reflective practice is really so valuable. So we define reflective practice by the process of reflecting on one's actions in order to facilitate a cycle of continued learning. And this can be broken down into reflection in action, which occurs during the therapy process, and reflection on action, when the reflective practitioner looks back on events. And these definitions are derived from Donald Schoen's book, The Reflective Practitioner, which, similar to maybe Engaging Autism in the Floortime World, is a seminal work. This is probably the seminal work of reflective practice. And then reflective supervision is a process for supporting and development of reflective practice through supervision. And it's got 3 core elements: reflection, collaboration, and regularity. And that definition is by Rebecca Shamoun-Shanak, who is in that world of infant mental health. So they've really created a really robust framework for reflective supervision. So I became super interested through that literature review in Shun's framework, especially. I found that resonated really well with me. I think that he really elucidates the art of practice. That's the most beautiful thing to me that I took away from his book. And I've always found this resonating with me too. For a long time in my work, I've really looked at OT practice as a complicated fusion of, an art and a technical skill. And then I read his book. I'm like, oh, this is exactly what he's talking about. This is the complicated work of fusing something that is scientific with something that is artful. Um, and he talks about, in terms of obstacles again, right? Culture, that this is something that's really challenging for us in the scientific world because all of our scientific schools, all of our institutions were founded at a time when technical rationality and positivism were in vogue. So this is the idea that scientific theory will always guide us to an answer. There will always be a very like an outcome, a scientific proof that is able to be assured. And if it doesn't fit, then we find a new theory that is the one that is always going to pinpoint what we need to do. And that's still to some degree the basis of science, right? We believe in something until we can disprove it. But positivism really is this idea that we know it, right? It's certain, we're locked into it. And since then, I think our academic institutions have kind of grown past the idea that there's always a specific, specific approach that's proven correct, right? But we still have this sort of institutional framework that's built around this and kind of locks us into a very scientific way of thinking. A lot of our schools have grown from Donald Schoen's work and have integrated a lot of reflective components, but it's still in the current, it's still in the culture. So it's hard for people that are professionals to believe in this idea that you can kind of use your intuition and you can, in the moment, kind of reflect on what you're doing and use that to pivot and think flexibly and paint pictures of what's going on, right? That's the art. We can use that metaphor well. It's the art of practice. So instead of thinking about it as this is like the theory, this is the hard theory, and this is how I need to act in my daily life, I can flow. I can use myself artfully and draw upon things I've learned, but also try to reflect on what's happening in the moment. And I think a lot of the tools we use in floor time are really the same tools we use in floor time, right? We talk about wonder, curiosity, seeing the big picture, looking both outward and inwardly, and then being comfortable with uncertainty. That's a big piece, I think, as well in floor time, and why we're such a great model for, I think, taking on change. We've always been built flexibly, right? Which is the great thing about the floor time model. I feel like we're like water. We can go with the current, and as things continue to grow and change and neurodiversity becomes a bigger paradigm, we're ready for it. We've always been ready for it. I've always been excited about that. Um, I have more thoughts, but do you have any questions? I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Yeah, no, it is a good point because, I think again, from a parent perspective, we have this idea that our children get diagnosed and we go to the experts and they can help us. And that's sort of, I mean, roughly the equivalent of what you're saying here, this scientific method and this way that things are supposed to be done. And putting in that other piece that's more subjective, that's more flexible, that's intuition driven, that's, based on experiences and whatever. I think we all know that when we go to see an experienced professional, we feel more comfortable because they have that experience and they've seen so many children that they can draw these experiences from. And who knows if AI will, how it will impact that, right? Because they say you'll go to the doctor and AI will have millions of cases to reflect from, or what, not reflect, but you know what I mean, to sort through, to predict what is going on with this person that could be better than a person's. But there's a saying, brains over bots, right?
Mhm.
Like our brains have something that can beat AI because of this piece that you're talking about that's more artful.
That's
Go ahead.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I think you hit the nail on the head with that. It resembles reflection, right? This is why reflection again is so elusive, I think, as a concept, because like it would be so easy to think of what the machine's doing as reflective, but it's surface. It's not deep. It's not going to be able to interpret in an artful way. It's always going to go back to its data and use that data instead of kind of using all of our ability to really think creatively. The human mind has capacity for that.
And the nuance, all the nuance, and floor time really is, and DIR is about that nuance.
It is. It is. Um, can I talk about one of my favorite things that Donald Schoen talks about in his book that I think pairs nicely with DIR floor time? Um, he talks about the idea of the generative metaphor in his book. And I think that is such a beautiful piece of what we were just talking about, right? This artful use of our minds, but also ties so well with so many of our floor time concepts and how we teach and how we learn. So the idea of a generative metaphor is it's a metaphor that generates like the ability to reflect, right? The ability to kind of reframe, to picture, to envision, and paint a picture of our problems. And I don't know if I mentioned this yet either, but in addition to being artful, this reflective practice is really about the idea of really just being comfortable setting the problem being able to describe and kind of create what the problem is in our minds instead of jumping to the solution, because we're so solutions driven, and just being able to take time and really fully grasp the problem and know what it is and understand it and be able to describe it in itself is incredibly powerful, because not all problems are just solvable. There's not, oh, in especially in relationship-based work, we can't go into it with this idea that every problem is a solvable problem, but it can be made clear. And just by making it clear, we usually feel more comfortable moving forward. So the generative metaphor is a really powerful tool for that. And he describes it as generative metaphor because it generates reflection. So, for example, if I was to say it's raining cats and dogs, it's probably not a generative metaphor because I don't think it helps me understand the rain any better. It's just a silly way of describing heavy rain. But let's say I'm using the example of I'm looking at a kid that is, getting dysregulated. I say he's going 0 to 60. That might help me elucidate the fact that there's like a rapid trigger, right? And how can I gain some space in that moment? That's one good example of that. I think in the floor time model, I am especially fond of the learning tree, and I always talk about the learning tree in classes. Because I think it is such a powerful generative metaphor for reframing the way people think about childhood development. I think for a lot of people that are embracing floor time, that is the metaphor that helps them see that we can't just program our kids into success. We need to help them grow. And the nurture and the affect is the piece that does that. So it's a really powerful reflective metaphor, a generative metaphor that we use in the floor time model. I'm a
So
very
let me just pause there for a minute for people that aren't familiar. The Learning Tree was Stanley Greenspan's last book before he passed. And Jake Greenspan does have a good video describing the Learning Tree. And I shared in a podcast, I had gone at least 7 or 8 years ago now to bring my son to Jake Greenspan because I'd heard all about Stanley Greenspan. I wanted to meet his son. And something very powerful that he shared with me that has stuck with me about the learning tree was, years ago, I was waiting and waiting. Is my son ever going to reach the fourth functional emotional developmental capacity? Am I ever going to see imaginary play? What's going on? And he described, and I was familiar with the learning tree, but he said, you know what? I don't see this in all children, but in your son, I see all 6 functional emotional developmental capacities. It's just that the trunk is very narrow. And so we need to widen that trunk, meaning in certain conditions, we might see peaks into the 5th and 6th capacity, but only under these certain conditions. Now we need to widen that by making sure he can have these capacities shine in different environments, with different people, in different situations, when he's distressed as well as when he's happy, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that really helped me frame that whole concept of the tree. You have the roots in the bottom that are the almost pre-regulation kind of things and individual differences or whatever. And then the tree trunk is the functional emotional developmental capacities, usually up to the first 6. And then the leaves and everything are all the things that sort of come after that, which is all academics and everything else. And it is a nice illustration, especially for parents to understand. But I just wanted to put that out there for people that weren't familiar with it.
No, I think that's great. And I'm glad that you had a personal experience with the learning tree as well. I think that it, for so many, helps really, again, see what's happening. And just like in this framework, it didn't really solve a problem for you, but it painted the picture. And just by doing that, you felt like you could kind of take a path forward. That's the other thing I love about Shun's framework for reflection is we didn't talk specifically about the idea of like reflection in action and reflection on action yet, but he talks about that a lot in his book. And what I like about it is that reflection in action or on action is really about action. So I think one reason we knock reflection is because people think about, oh, you're just getting stuck in your own head. You're not doing anything, right? But this framework really gives us the idea of like what we are doing is actually giving us our path forward instead of having what we might call, like, if we're going to use an artist metaphor, writer's block or just feeling obstructed. It gives us the ability to kind of get situated and then take a path forward. Now, this could happen very quickly. Reflection in action is usually the idea of like you're in the moment and you kind of have some aha. And if we're doing this in floor time, it could look like the I wonder or just saying, oh, there's a lot of ways we kind of bring that voice to life.
And Andrea Davis described it as picturing you wearing a GoPro on your head and watching yourself as you're doing floor time to sort of have that in mind while you're also staying in the moment, which is tricky, which can be very tricky.
Very tricky, right? I mean, it's not impossible. We do it a lot in the floor time world, but you have to be in the right space for it, or you have to have the right people around you in the right environment, right? Just like our kids, right? Just like we talk about tailoring the environment, we need all these things too if we're really going to be reflective. But that's the idea of reflection in action, is being able to choose our path forward or know when to just kind of wait, right? Being able to be patient. Being patient itself is an action, I think. So we can reflect and we can choose what we want to do instead of either feeling pressurized to act or feeling paralyzed to act. So I think that's the power of reflection in the moment. Reflection in the moment can also happen over the long term, which I think is interesting. So if you have an ongoing problem, it still would technically be reflection in action because you are thinking about how to solve that problem that is still happening. So that could be something like if you're working with a child and transitions are really hard, it's still an ongoing problem. And you might reflect on a particular transition, but you still are reflecting on like how you can continue to support that problem that is still arising for you in your, daily life. And reflection on action is really looking back at events, but still thinking about how you can kind of refine what you're doing to support your children in the future. And that's the beautiful vessel for the video that we talked about, right? That's the best, I think, of both worlds for reflection in action and on action, because we can still really have it fresh with us, right? Any other reflection on action, is a painting of past events, which can be distorted or make it a little harder to really get into our reflective lens. But we can truly take that step back and see when we're watching the video of what's happening, which is why I love it so much.
And you remember in that moment, like, oh yeah, I remember I was thinking blah, 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 which you might have forgotten. But the thing that the reflection on action, the value of it for me is seeing what you missed.
Yeah.
So I saw so many cues my son was giving me, and I just ignored them because I had my agenda in my head, right? And I think that's very powerful.
Yes. Yeah, that's a
Especially
good
when
one.
you're learning. Like I can imagine new practitioners, they're so, oh, I remember I learned this and I learned this, I got to put this into practice. And they're thinking about that so much that they miss what's right in front of them sometimes. And that's okay. And that's the thing about reflection, is that it's okay that that happened, and it's okay to acknowledge it, and you want it in your awareness because it's a process. We're all working towards, getting that process. And of course, stuff will kick us from the side, from the back, that disrupt the process, but we just, it's a process.
Yeah, it's a
Life
practice. It's a
happens.
process. It's a practice, right? It's like it's definitely the whole idea of this is practice. And that's again the thing that I think ties it so well to the floor time model. Because we are firm believers of this as a process and a practice and not something you can just learn and then be done learning, because it is incredibly fluid and dynamic. So it has so much depth. So I really am a big fan of integrating reflection into the work, and just again putting that focus on it, because it is something that is so empowering to us. Um, would it be helpful for me to give an early example in my career of a time when I maybe missed reflection and then now can look back on how reflection would have helped?
Sure, absolutely.
So, when I was working at the Rebecca School, again, immersed in so much beautiful reflective culture, but I don't think I had the subcurrent of understanding reflection well yet. So I would have moments where I was really trying to integrate sort of something I've learned from, a coursework into my practice and sometimes miss the mark. So a good example was when I was really trying to integrate sensory integration learning I had, talking about the idea of arousal states. So I had taken a beautiful class that talked about the idea of arousal states, how alert we are, is not always correlated with how active we are. And really looking at the idea of how a child is either seeking consistency and rhythmicity as a sign of that they may be overstimulated and over aroused, and seeking novelty as a sign there may be under alerted, right? Because you're trying to seek some new novel stimulus to get yourself more alerted, which in some contexts is super accurate. But I found myself trying to apply this to everything. And I went so far as during one of our weekly Greenspan case study meetings to describe a child that was frequently falling asleep in class as hyper aroused and hyper alert because he was rigid and wouldn't accept change. And I looked back on that afterwards and like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would I possibly say that? Well, because I was trying to draw from a very specific scientific framework instead of simply observing and thinking. So dynamically, there are a lot of complexities with arousal level, right? Tying from how well we sleep at night to tying to how well we are responding in a particular context or environment. So this child was very rigid about certain transitions, and in those moments was probably overwhelmed, but it would be very hard to describe that state of arousal as consistently hyper alerted. So I think that for me is again a great example of if I had a better reflective framework at the time, the idea of just painting a picture of what's going on in this whole child's life instead of focusing on a specific scientific piece, I would have been better equipped to really understand the big picture. So I'm happy to talk about my own past shortcomings and in acknowledging this is how we learn and how we continue to reflect.
Now, okay, this may be taking us off track a little bit, but I just want to throw this out there too, because I know you alluded to it before. You said some people say that reflective practice is getting stuck in our head. And I wanted to jump on that point because I've been on a mailing list of Arnold Schwarzenegger's new pump club. And he talks about how um, sometimes, and this is for workouts, people analyze, oh, am I working out enough? Am I doing it this way? Oh, should I do it in the morning or the night? Or should I eat this much protein or that much protein? And he says, like, it doesn't matter. Just do it. Whatever you can do is better than doing nothing. Now, that's not exactly equivalent to what we're talking about, but I can imagine that there might be some people who get stuck in the reflection and over analyze and over reflect, and then that might impede them from just being in the moment and attuning to somebody. And so that's one thing that yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's the difference, though, between reflective practice and just getting lost in thought. Because again, I think the terms we use are really important. So, you know, describing my past example, I was probably lost in my thoughts and I was getting stuck in scientific frameworks, but I wasn't really engaging in reflective practice. I wasn't like painting a picture of my situation, then just figuring out how to play and engage and connect with the kiddo in the way that supports their, fluctuating arousal states in the moment. So I think that's a part of it for sure. I think if we're really being a reflective practitioner or a reflective parent, we are really just kind of, again, engaging in an active process of observing and then figuring out how we want to act in that moment. And that it sounds very simple, but it's actually a hard thing to do. And so again, talking to someone, creating a narrative, having a space for reflective practice, and what we call reflective supervision, which is when you have that partner, right? And you're able to do that with regularity. And really that partner is just someone that's there with you and not like there to critique you or supervise you, is really powerful. Yeah.
Do you think that making a plan is part of reflective practice?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, making a plan can be a reflective practice if that plan is not a purely I'm taking something from a book or from a theory and putting that into what
Or
I'm going
too
to do.
prescriptive?
Too prescriptive, exactly. I think that a plan of action can be helpful, right? But I think that it is helpful if it is derived from a reflective thought process. Um, I am going to give one more example. I have a colleague that, a few years back, um, she had taken her 201 and 202 DIR courses. And she was really thinking about a kiddo she was working with and was saying, Andrew, I really just want to play with this child, but this child is becoming, you know, dysregulated without structure. And I feel like I'm not being a good floor timer. And I said, well, let's think about this child's needs. What's happening with this child? And we were talking about regulation and all the factors and observing the fact that too much of a lack of structure right away was actually overwhelming for this child. So it was an interesting example of like individual differences still are something to reflect on. And it's easy to get stuck even in the floor time world of like, free play is where the magic happens, but kids can still need structure as a starting point to help them feel regulated, and that's okay too. So we came forth with a plan from our reflection is like, oh, maybe it's just going to be really helpful to start our session by creating a plan or a visual schedule, right? And then you could still incorporate all kinds of wonderful floor time pieces into your session. So that was a plan derived from a reflective process. And that plan should also be dynamic as it goes on, because if our goal is to really create wonderful floor time sessions, we probably want to continue to work on scaling back some of that structure and getting that child more comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. So I think having a plan is great as long as that plan continues to be dynamic and reflective.
Yes, and for that, I'll refer people to the two-part podcast I did with Joanne Fleckenstein and Mike Fields on praxis, because sometimes, actually, a lot of parents say to me, I don't, my child doesn't want to play. They just keep running around or this or that. And in that case, yes, it might be more helpful to have a structure because motor planning and praxis might play into it. And I think the important point here is that you said the plan is always dynamic. And so we're always kind of reflecting in the moment, where is the child today developmentally? How are their individual differences impacting them today? How is the relationship going today? Is my parent having something on their mind and they're coming at me with a different affect that's impacting the way I'm reacting? All of these things that come into play. And again, there's so many variables every single day. You can never just pin it down to a prescription, which is why floor time is so difficult for a lot of people, because there isn't a prescription.
There's no prescription. It is that, and that's what's great. We have sort of fundamental principles, right? We have a framework, but we have so much flexibility, and it really comes back to practice. So that's what's so great about it. It's a beautiful model. I think it can take on so many things.
Well, thank you so much for all this information, Andrew. It's been a great reflection on reflection, and I wanted to ask to put in the blog post how people can access your course. Is it available yet? Is it coming soon?
Yeah, it is. It's coming up soon, and I think by the time this airs, it should be available for enrollment. It is a 3.5 hour self-paced course, so we as floor timers love our live time, and I found it very different to record a class without a live audience. But I also think it's a nice starting point for reflection is to be able to kind of just learn about it on its own. And I think it holds water as a self-paced course. I think it's pretty light and breezy. And I think it really helps just focus on the reflective components itself and work on refining the idea of reflective practice as a starting point. So it's called Reflective Practice in Peds. It's on the Therapeutic Edge Collective, TEC. Yeah, I would, if people want to enroll, I think they would enjoy it.
Great. Well, I will put links to that in the blog post for today. Thank you so much, Andrew. It was great to finally be able to have you on the podcast.
Oh, it was such a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.
Until next time, here's to choosing play and experiencing joy every day. The International Council on Development and Learning has short courses coming up, along with our certificate courses at icdl.com/courses. I will be offering my course, DIR 402, Be Sure, Supporting, Understanding, and Respecting the Expectations of Parents for Practitioners, live online Wednesday, June 19th. Check out the times in your time zone at icdl.com/courses.